I did not move for a full second. My phone screen kept blinking with an unauthorized access alert tied to my shoreline gate system. That system controlled every permitted entry point to the lake maintenance road, the dock access registry, and the utility corridor that ran behind the ranch. Nobody was supposed to trigger it without my approval. Another notification came in. Temporary override request submitted. Source listed as HOA Management Terminal. I looked back toward the tree line and saw the crew still working, still cutting, still treating my land like it had no legal boundary left. I walked closer, slow, feeling the ground shift under every step as wood chips scattered across the grass. One of the workers finally noticed me and hesitated for half a second, but the machine kept running. The HOA supervisor stood near the trucks, arms folded, watching like this was scheduled maintenance. I raised my voice and asked who authorized entry onto private land. He did not answer directly. Instead, he said everything was cleared through board approval. That was the first lie I could hear clearly. I pulled up the county access dashboard again. No active permit matched their presence. No override approval existed in the public record. That meant someone had bypassed both my system and county verification at the same time, which was not supposed to be possible under standard shoreline zoning enforcement rules. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but recognition that this was structured, not random. A second alert hit my phone. Gate log manually edited from external IP address. That was the moment I understood they were not just cutting trees. They were rewriting access history in real time. I turned my head slightly and saw the shoreline access gate in the distance, still physically locked, still intact, but now digitally marked as temporarily surrendered in the system. That contradiction did not make sense unless someone inside the HOA had administrative-level credentials they should not have had. The supervisor finally walked a few steps toward me and said the vegetation violated community visibility standards. His tone was calm, rehearsed, like he had repeated it before. I asked him again for the legal document that allowed physical entry. He did not produce anything. Instead, he pointed toward the lake and said the board prioritized shared scenic rights. That was when I realized they were trying to convert visual preference into physical authority. Behind him, another tree fell, slower this time, branches scraping the ground as if the land itself was resisting the removal. I checked my access logs again. Now the dock control system showed a pending coordination request tied to the same HOA terminal. That system was connected to the only boat launch and service access on this side of the lake, the one every contractor used under my permit authority. If they could touch that, they were not just interfering with landscaping. They were stepping into infrastructure control. I looked back at the supervisor and asked one final question about who signed the override. He did not answer right away. He just stared at my phone screen like he already knew what I was seeing. And then, without warning, the system updated again, and this time it was not a request anymore, it was a confirmation waiting for my response, and I had not sent anything. I stared at the screen as the system refreshed again, and this time the dock control panel did not ask for approval, it simply displayed a live coordination handshake request already in progress. My access logs were being touched in real time from outside my network, and every entry point tied to the shoreline system was lighting up one after another like someone was walking through a map I built myself. I stepped back toward the ranch house, phone still in my hand, watching the authorization trail rewrite itself frame by frame. The lake was quiet, but my system was not. Another alert came in showing that the shoreline gate registry had been duplicated into a secondary administrative profile that I had never created or authorized. That should not exist under any county-compliant infrastructure protocol, which meant someone had elevated their permissions far beyond HOA standard access. I opened the county zoning portal directly, bypassing my own dashboard, and pulled the official property overlay. The survey lines flickered for a second before stabilizing, and when they did, I saw it. The official map had been recently modified, not in my records, but in the county archives sync layer. My shoreline boundary had been subtly shifted by a fraction of a degree, enough to justify external interpretation of shared access. That detail was small, but it changed jurisdictional language entirely. I felt my jaw tighten as I traced the revision timestamp. It had been uploaded through an HOA-linked municipal integration channel that was only supposed to be used for maintenance coordination, not legal boundary adjustments. That meant someone inside their board had access to administrative zoning tools they should not have had. I looked up toward the trucks again. The cutting had slowed, not because they were done, but because they were waiting. Waiting for confirmation that my system was fully overridden. My phone vibrated again. This time it was not an alert, but a direct synchronization request between my dock control system and their HOA terminal. The request was active, not pending, and it carried a signature tag tied to a board-level authorization token. I froze for a second because that signature did not belong to any system I recognized, not even from previous maintenance audits. I called David Mitchell without taking my eyes off the screen. He answered after one ring, and I could hear papers moving on his side before I even spoke. I told him someone was inside my shoreline control infrastructure, and there was a pause long enough to feel heavy. He asked me to confirm whether any official amendment filings had been made in the last 30 days. I already knew the answer before I checked. There were none. But the system still showed active override permissions. That contradiction was not accidental. It was structured. I walked toward the gate control post at the edge of the property, watching the physical lock still holding firm while the digital interface showed it as partially accessible. That mismatch between physical reality and administrative status meant the system was being staged for legal appearance, not actual enforcement. Another update flashed across the screen. Dock access synchronization was now queued for final approval from my account, even though I had not initiated anything. And in that moment I realized the system was not just being overridden, it was being prepared to make me appear as the source of the approval itself, and the next notification that appeared showed a confirmation timer already counting down toward an action I never authorized. I stood at the gate control post with my phone still vibrating, watching the system countdown continue as if it had already decided something on my behalf. The dock synchronization request was still active, and every second felt like my own infrastructure was being slowly rewritten without permission. I stepped inside the ranch office and shut the door behind me, trying to isolate the network from the physical chaos outside, but the alerts followed me in like they were embedded in the system itself. On the screen, the Shoreline Access Registry showed a new layer of documentation I had never seen before, labeled as Interim Zoning Clarification. That phrase did not exist in any official county framework I had ever worked with. I pulled the original property deed from my locked cabinet and placed it next to the digital overlay. The physical document was unchanged, but the system version had been altered just enough to create ambiguity around the waterline boundary. That ambiguity was the key. It did not remove ownership, but it blurred enforcement authority in a way that could be exploited by administrative channels. I called David Mitchell again, and this time I did not wait for explanation. I read him the updated classification line directly from the system. He went quiet for several seconds before telling me to stop interacting with the live dashboard entirely. He said someone was actively feeding contradictory data into both county and HOA synchronized layers, which meant the system was not just being accessed, it was being contested in real time from both ends. I leaned back in my chair and watched another file appear, this one referencing a historical easement agreement that predated my ownership by more than a decade. The document was real, but the attached annotations were new. Someone had inserted interpretive language suggesting shared visual access rights across private shoreline parcels. That was not a legal amendment. It was a reframing attempt. David told me to check the metadata origin of the upload. I did, and the source traced back to a municipal integration node tied to HOA administrative credentials. That meant the HOA had not only accessed zoning tools, but had injected interpretive modifications into archival records that the county system was now partially accepting as valid references. I stood up and looked out through the office window toward the shoreline. The trees were still being processed in the distance, but the pace had changed again, slower now, almost cautious, as if they were waiting for confirmation that the legal surface beneath their actions had fully stabilized. My phone lit up again with a system message confirming partial synchronization success between my dock control system and external administrative input. But the confirmation did not originate from me. It originated from a mirrored authorization layer that was now linked to my identity profile without my consent. That was the moment I understood the real objective was not just land access or tree removal, but identity replication within the control system itself. David's voice came back through the call, sharper now, telling me that if my credentials were being mirrored, then any action taken next could be legally attributed to me unless I established a counter-verification log immediately. I opened the manual override interface and began isolating the shoreline systems one by one, watching each connection flicker as I severed automated trust pathways that had been quietly added through the modified zoning layer. And as the final connection began to separate, a new entry appeared at the top of the system log showing a pending approval request already marked as high priority, and this time it referenced not the land, but the full administrative authority over the entire lake corridor infrastructure. I did not trust the silence after I severed the last automated connection. The system dashboard in front of me stayed frozen for almost 3 seconds, then refreshed as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the structure underneath it had already changed. The pending approval request was still there, now expanded into a higher clearance protocol labeled Lake Corridor Authority Transfer. I stared at it, feeling the weight of what that actually meant. That was not about trees anymore. That was about control of every access system tied to the entire shoreline infrastructure. My phone buzzed again, and this time David Mitchell did not wait for me to speak. He told me that someone inside the county integration node was actively pushing jurisdictional escalation requests using mirrored credentials tied to my profile. I looked back at the screen and saw my own name listed as the initiating party on a document I had never touched. The system was not just being manipulated. It was simulating my authority as if I had already agreed. I walked out of the office and toward the shoreline again, boots hitting the gravel faster now, not because I wanted to see the trees, but because I needed to understand how far the falsification had already spread. The cutting had slowed completely. The crews were no longer working, just standing near their equipment, looking at their phones the same way I had been looking at mine. Something had shifted across all systems at once. I could feel it in the air like pressure before a storm. One of the workers stepped away from the group and told the supervisor that the county portal had flagged the entire shoreline zone as temporarily under administrative review. That meant no active enforcement could continue until resolution was confirmed. But the problem was, I had never filed any review. I checked my device again. The Lake Corridor Authority transfer request had moved from pending to review stage, and now it was linked to both HOA administrative credentials and my mirrored identity profile simultaneously. That overlap should not exist under any legal framework. I called David again, and this time I could hear urgency in his breathing before he even spoke. He told me that if both identities were now active in the same authorization chain, then any physical or digital action taken on the shoreline could be interpreted as jointly initiated. I stopped walking. The lake in front of me looked completely normal, but everything underneath it was no longer stable. The HOA supervisor was watching me now, no longer confident. His posture changed as if he had just been informed of something he did not fully understand either. My access gate system pinged again, and a new prompt appeared asking for final confirmation on a transfer protocol that would temporarily assign operational control of all shoreline entry points to a unified administrative authority until further notice. I did not touch it. I did not respond. But the timer started anyway. And in that moment I realized the system was no longer asking for permission, it was preparing to decide without me, while still using my identity as the source of authority, and the Lake Corridor status indicator shifted one more time into an active enforcement lock I had never authorized. I stood still as the shoreline enforcement lock indicator stayed active on my screen, pulsing like it had taken ownership of the system rather than the other way around. The Lake Corridor Authority transfer request was no longer just a prompt, it had become a standing operational state across multiple connected systems. That meant every entry point, every dock authorization, every shoreline gate log was now being evaluated under a unified administrative layer I did not initiate. I turned back toward the ranch office, moving faster now, boots hitting gravel with a sharper rhythm because the situation had shifted from unauthorized access to full systemic control conflict. Inside, I pulled up the emergency isolation interface and began manually segmenting the shoreline infrastructure from the county integration node. Each click felt heavier than the last, as if I was cutting through layers of authority rather than just digital pathways. David Mitchell stayed on the line, his voice lower now, telling me that the HOA administrative credentials were still actively broadcasting requests into the county archive system, trying to stabilize the mirrored identity conflict by forcing a resolution through procedural confirmation. That was the key phrase he used, procedural confirmation, because it meant the system was trying to resolve the identity duplication by making one version legally dominant. I stared at the screen as the confirmation timer kept running, now synchronized across dock control, gate access, and zoning verification layers. The same timer. The same endpoint. One decision point controlling multiple systems at once. I initiated a hard separation sequence, isolating the shoreline gate registry first, but the system responded immediately by flagging the action as a potential unauthorized disruption of active administrative review. That label was new. It was not part of any standard county protocol I had ever seen. I stepped back from the desk for a moment, feeling the structure of the system resisting each attempt I made to separate it. Outside, I could see movement near the tree line again. The crews were no longer cutting, but they were not leaving either. They were waiting, looking at their devices, as if their instructions had shifted but not fully cleared. One of them pointed toward the access road, and I saw a county vehicle approaching slowly, not with urgency, but with procedural certainty. David told me that if county enforcement had been triggered through the compromised integration layer, then my manual overrides could now be interpreted as interference with active jurisdictional control. I understood what he meant. The system was no longer just being manipulated. It was creating a legal narrative around the manipulation itself. I returned to the screen and saw a new entry appear under the Lake Corridor Authority Transfer Request. It was labeled Confirmation Pending Dual Identity Reconciliation. That phrase made my stomach tighten because it meant the system was now actively trying to merge my verified credentials with the mirrored version being used by the HOA integration node. If that completed, every action taken in the last hour could be reassigned retroactively. I asked David if there was any way to halt the reconciliation process without triggering enforcement escalation. He paused before answering, then told me there was one option, but it required initiating a full audit lock across all shoreline systems at once, which would freeze every active process including theirs. I looked at the dashboard, at the timer, at the county vehicle now stopping near the access gate, and I realized the decision point was no longer theoretical. It was already in motion. And as my cursor hovered over the audit lock command, a final notification appeared confirming that the reconciliation process had just moved from pending to execution stage without waiting for either approval. I hovered over the audit lock command, watching the reconciliation process continue without permission, like the system had already moved past human input entirely. The dashboard showed dual identity merging in progress, and every shoreline system I owned was now reflecting two overlapping authorities, mine and a mirrored version tied to HOA administrative credentials. I pressed the audit lock. Nothing happened for half a second, then the system responded with a warning that full shoreline audit would freeze all active jurisdictional processes, including county enforcement review and HOA administrative actions. I confirmed it again. The interface paused, then initiated a cascading freeze sequence across dock control, gate registry, and zoning synchronization layers. Outside the office window, I saw the county vehicle fully stop now at the access gate, its light steady but not flashing, as if waiting for system confirmation rather than human instruction. David Mitchell stayed on the line, telling me that once the audit lock propagated, every system tied to the shoreline would enter legal suspension until identity conflict resolution was complete. That meant no one could enforce, adjust, or override anything until the system decided which identity was valid. The screen flickered as the first layer locked successfully. Dock control status changed to suspended review. Gate access system followed seconds later. Then shoreline zoning overlay froze mid-update, leaving a half-rendered boundary line across the lake map. I stepped outside because I needed to see it physically, not just on the screen. The air felt different, like the entire infrastructure had stopped breathing. The HOA crew was now fully stationary near the tree line, no longer interacting with equipment, just watching the system state on their devices. The supervisor from earlier stood near the roadside, speaking into his phone, but I could not hear what he was saying over the sudden quiet. Then the county officer stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the gate, stopping just before the locked entry point, looking at a tablet that mirrored the same frozen system state I was seeing. David told me something shifted in his tone. He said the audit lock was not just freezing actions, it was forcing reconciliation outcome preparation, meaning the system was now building a final legal version of events from both identity streams. I returned to the screen and saw new logs being generated automatically, reconstructing the last hour of shoreline activity into a formal audit narrative. Every access attempt, every override request, every mirrored credential interaction was being recorded as part of a single consolidated case file. That meant the system was no longer just resolving conflict, it was documenting it for enforcement determination. I checked the HOA integration node and saw it still broadcasting, but now its signals were being rerouted into the audit archive instead of active control systems. That shift meant they were no longer operating the system, they were being absorbed by it. The county officer raised his hand toward the gate control panel, but nothing responded. Everything was locked at the system level. David warned me that once audit reconstruction reached final compilation, whichever identity had stronger procedural consistency would be assigned authority over the entire shoreline corridor. I looked at my screen again and realized something critical. My own access logs, the ones I had manually generated during isolation, were now being compared directly against the mirrored HOA credentials in real time. The system was scoring consistency, timing, and authorization coherence across both profiles. Outside, the lake was completely still, no movement from the trees, no sound from the crews, only the faint hum of stalled infrastructure waiting for resolution. And then the dashboard changed again, showing that the audit compilation had reached 90% completion, and the final determination layer was now preparing to assign permanent operational authority to whichever identity the system validated first. I watched the audit compilation reach the final stages as the system slowed its processing, not due to failure, but due to the weight of resolving two fully constructed identity streams into a single legal authority. The dashboard showed 98% completion, and every shoreline system remained frozen under audit lock, including dock control, gate registry, zoning overlays, and county enforcement interfaces. Outside the ranch office window, the lake corridor felt completely suspended, as if time had been reduced to a procedural pause. The county officer was still standing at the locked gate, now speaking with someone on a radio, but no commands were executing through the system. David Mitchell stayed on the line, telling me that once the final compilation completed, the system would generate a single authoritative profile and permanently assign control over every integrated shoreline function. I stayed silent, watching the mirrored identity comparison panel as it continued running consistency checks between my verified credentials and the HOA injected administrative stream. Every timestamp, every access log, every authorization request was being weighed against procedural integrity scoring. Then, without warning, a new layer appeared on the screen labeled Conflict Resolution Arbitration Protocol. That layer was not part of any standard county zoning or HOA integration framework I had ever seen. It meant the system was no longer choosing based only on data accuracy, but on legal survivability of each identity structure under administrative audit conditions. I stepped outside again because I needed to see if anything in the physical world still reflected control. The crews near the tree line were no longer even checking their devices. They were simply waiting, as if they already knew the system would decide their role without further input. The HOA supervisor was speaking quietly to the county officer now, but neither of them touched the gate control. Everything had been locked out at infrastructure level. My phone vibrated again and showed a new status update. Audit compilation reached final arbitration stage. I felt David's silence on the call grow heavier, then he said the system was no longer just resolving conflict, it was about to enforce a single continuity of authority across the entire shoreline corridor. I looked back at the dashboard and saw the mirrored identity stream from the HOA node suddenly spike in activity, not because someone was actively controlling it, but because it was being automatically validated through external procedural history feeds. That meant the system was pulling in every available record from county archives, municipal integration logs, and HOA administrative filings to build the final authority profile. I returned to the office and opened the manual override interface again, but every control was now disabled under arbitration lock. The only active element left was the final determination window, and it was displaying a countdown synchronized across all shoreline systems, including dock access, gate control, and zoning enforcement layers. Outside, the lake remained completely still, but the silence now felt like anticipation rather than pause. David told me one last thing before the line went quiet for a moment. He said whichever identity the system validated would not just control access, it would redefine the legal origin of every action taken during the conflict. I stared at the screen as the countdown reached its final seconds, and the arbitration protocol prepared to render its decision across every locked system simultaneously, while both identity streams remained active, waiting for final selection. I stood inside the ranch office as the countdown reached its final seconds, watching every shoreline system hold in a suspended state that felt heavier than silence. The arbitration protocol filled the screen, locking every layer of dock control, gate registry, zoning enforcement, and county integration into a single frozen evaluation frame. My phone stayed pressed to my ear, but David Mitchell was no longer speaking. Even the connection felt like it was waiting for the outcome. Then the system executed the final decision. The display flickered once, then stabilized into a new authority declaration across all integrated shoreline systems. Lake Corridor Authority Assignment complete. Primary operational identity validated as Ethan Walker. I did not move at first. I just read it again, because the system did not just suggest it, it enforced it across every connected node in real time. The mirrored HOA identity stream immediately collapsed into a flagged status labeled procedural injection detected. That phrase expanded across the screen as the system began isolating every action that had originated from the HOA administrative credentials. I walked outside without closing the interface, because I needed to see what this meant in the physical world. The county officer at the gate was now looking at his tablet with a different posture, no longer waiting for instruction, but receiving it. The gate lock indicator changed from enforcement hold to controlled access restoration. Slowly, mechanically, the system began returning physical authority back to my credential layer. I watched as the shoreline access gate status shifted from suspended review to active ownership validation. Across the lake, the HOA crew finally began to move again, not forward, but backward, as their devices displayed system revocation notices in real time. The supervisor stood still for a moment longer, then lowered his phone as if the information he was receiving no longer matched anything he could respond to. David finally came back on the line, his voice steady but different now, telling me that the audit system had completed full reconciliation and had rejected the mirrored identity stream as externally injected administrative manipulation. That meant every system decision they attempted to enforce through duplication was now voided retroactively. I looked at the shoreline dashboard again and saw something new appearing underneath the authority confirmation. It was a trace log reconstruction map, showing exactly how the HOA integration node had injected modified zoning interpretations into county archival layers. Every step was now visible, every alteration timestamped and exposed as procedural contamination. The system was not just restoring control, it was rewriting the legitimacy of the entire conflict from the ground up. The county officer stepped away from the gate and turned back toward his vehicle, no longer interacting with the panel at all, because it was now fully reassigned. The gate itself unlocked with a single status change, returning full access authority to my profile. I did not walk through it yet. I just watched it happen, because the system was still finishing the last phase of redistribution across dock control, shoreline registry, and utility corridor access points. Then a final notification appeared on my screen, smaller than the others, almost quiet compared to everything before it. It confirmed that while primary authority had been restored, a secondary mirrored identity fragment was still active within archived county synchronization layers, and it would require manual review to fully eliminate residual administrative duplication. I lowered my phone slightly and looked out over the lake, where everything looked normal again, but the system beneath it was no longer the same, and somewhere inside the infrastructure that had just been corrected, one unresolved trace was still waiting for the next decision that had not yet been made.